The old oak trees overhanging the neatly trimmed lawns provided welcome shade for the occasional passerby. Marilyn Hayworth, fixing a loose strand of brown hair, once again checked the mailbox among the flyers and utility bills. A glossy magazine she'd bought 3 months ago had gotten lost. She clutched the magazine to her chest, anticipating an evening with a cup of green tea and new fashion trends. The neighboring house, vacant for the past 8 months since the death of the old Mrs. Fletcher, had finally found a new owner through the low white picket fence. Marilyn watched the furniture-moving company's truck park in the driveway. 2 blue uniformed movers began unloading cardboard boxes and furniture, while a young man in a light-colored t-shirt and jeans supervised the process, checking a clipboard in his hands. Marilyn tugged at the hem of her floral summer dress. In her 42 years, she looked much younger thanks to regular fitness and meticulous grooming. 3 times a week she attended Pilates classes at the local sports club, and on Saturdays she got massages from Mrs. Chen, a silent Chinese woman with magic hands. A new neighbor noticed her gaze and waved hello. Marilyn responded with a slight nod, feeling embarrassed at being caught peeking. The man headed toward the fence and she had to move closer. "Hi, I'm Lance Caulfield, your new neighbor." His smile was open and inviting. "Marilyn Hayworth." She extended her hand in greeting, noting to herself that his handshake was firm but not excessive. "Welcome to Magnolia Street." "Thank you. I hope I'm not disturbing this lovely neighborhood." Lance ran a hand through his short-cropped blonde hair. "Moving was an ordeal. Half the boxes are unsigned, and I have no idea where anything is." Marilyn smiled involuntarily, remembering their own move 15 years ago, when she and Garrett had first bought the house. "If you need help unpacking, I could—" "Sir," one of the movers called out, "where do you want the couch?" "I apologize," Lance said with a guilty expression. "Duty calls, but maybe you could stop by for a cup of coffee sometime. When I've got the kitchen sorted out, at least." Marilyn spent the next few days watching Lance settle into his new home. He installed garden lights along the walkway, trimmed the sprawling jasmine bush by the porch, and painted the front door a deep blue. In the mornings, she'd seen him go out for a run in gym shorts and a t-shirt, and in the evenings he'd come home in black slacks and a white shirt, the uniform of a waiter at the Blue Oyster Cafe, she later learned. Garrett, her husband, was hardly ever home these days. His auto shop on the outskirts of town was experiencing an influx of customers, many preparing their cars for the upcoming fall season. He would leave before dawn and return in the dark, smelling of machine oil and fatigue. The best he could do was a hastily heated dinner and a half-hour of news, during which he often fell asleep in his worn leather chair. Friday night, as Marilyn was arranging the flowers she'd bought at the farmer's market, the doorbell rang. Lance stood on the doorstep with a bottle of wine in his hands. "I hope I'm not interrupting." He stepped from foot to foot. "I just wanted to thank you for the warm welcome. You don't get that in the big city." "You're from the big city?" Marilyn led him into the cool hallway. "Austin. I used to work in a fancy restaurant there, but—" He hesitated. "Sometimes you need a change of scenery." Just then the front door opened and Garrett walked in. His dark hair was disheveled with graying, and there were traces of machine oil on his cheek. "Oh, we have company?" He looked over at Lance. "Honey, this is our new neighbor, Lance Caulfield." Marilyn hurried to introduce them to each other. "Lance, this is my husband, Garrett." "Pleased to meet you, sir." Lance held out his hand. "I was just bringing a bottle of wine to celebrate the housewarming." "That's a great idea." Garrett shook the outstretched hand. "Just give me 10 minutes to clean up." The evening was unexpectedly pleasant. Lance turned out to be an interesting conversationalist, having traveled extensively around the country. He talked about music festivals in Austin, surfing in California, bartending in New Orleans. Even Garrett, usually silent with strangers, perked up when the conversation turned to cars. It turned out that Lance had a good eye for classic models. Marilyn watched them silently, noting the details. The way Lance held his wine glass elegantly. The way his long fingers absent-mindedly stroked the stem of the glass when he was engaged in conversation. The way wrinkles gathered in the corners of his eyes when he smiled. The way the light from the floor lamp played in his hair, creating a golden halo. After his guest left, Garrett went straight to bed, muttering something about an early shift. Marilyn was left to clear the table, machine-wiping glasses and putting plates in the dishwasher. The handkerchief Lance had left on the table was dark blue, with a small geometric pattern. She picked it up, smelling the subtle scent of men's perfume, and stood for a moment, holding it to her face. Then, coming to her senses, she folded it carefully and placed it on the shelf in the hallway. That night, Marilyn could not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of her husband and the ticking of the antique clock in the living room. Outside the window, oak trees rustled their leaves, a dog barked in the distance, and a second-story window burned in the neighboring house. Marilyn imagined that Lance might be awake too, reading a book or looking out the window at the scattering of stars over the sleepy town. The thought gave her a strange thrill, and she forced herself to shift her gaze to the ceiling, where the shadows of passing cars slowly crept in. In the morning, she woke up earlier than usual. Garrett was already gone, leaving an unfinished cup of coffee on the kitchen table. Marilyn went to the window. The sky was covered with gray clouds, promising rain. Lance's dark green Ford was parked in the driveway of the neighboring house. She caught herself waiting for him to go out for his morning run and was angry with herself for thinking that. September in Lake Charles was surprisingly cool. Marilyn began to frequent the Blue Oyster, a small cafe 2 blocks from her home. She convinced herself it was because of the excellent blueberry pie and freshly brewed coffee, but every time she saw Lance's tall figure maneuvering between tables with a tray in his hands, her heart began to beat faster. This Thursday, she took her usual table by the window. The rays of the afternoon sun shone through the thin lace of the curtains, creating fanciful patterns on the tabletop. Marilyn pulled an unread novel from her purse, but the lines blurred before her eyes. The usual? Black coffee and blueberry pie? A familiar voice made her wince. "Yes, please." She looked up at Lance. The waiter's white shirt emphasized his tan from the summer days. "The pie was especially good today." Mrs. Baker added a little cinnamon to the filling. He leaned a little closer, as if sharing a secret. When he brought the order, his fingers lingered on the cup for a moment, making contact with her hand. Marilyn felt the color flood her cheeks. "I finish at 6, Lance said quietly, wiping down a nearby table. "Why don't we go for a walk? The weather's lovely today." She knew she should say no. Knew she had to come up with a reason why she couldn't. But instead, she just nodded, not trusting her voice. They met outside the city park. Old willows leaned their branches against the water of a small pond where ducks swam lazily. Lance had changed his waiter's uniform into jeans and a dark blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. "You know, I see dozens of people at the cafe every day," he began as they walked slowly down the path littered with fallen leaves. "But you're different. There's something special about you." Marilyn grinned involuntarily. "Is that what you say to all the single housewives?" "I'm serious." He stopped and turned to her. "When you walk into a cafe, it's like everything around you lightens up. And it's not just your beauty. There's an understatement about you, a mystery." "Mystery?" She laughed nervously. "What secrets can there be in a town like ours? Everybody knows everybody. Everybody talks about everything. And yet..." His eyes scrutinized her face. "You're not happy, Marilyn. I can see it in your eyes when you think no one is looking." She turned away, feeling the tears coming up. The last years with Garrett had become a routine. Breakfast in silence, rare dinners, good night before bedtime. When was the last time they had a real conversation? When was the last time he'd looked at her the way Lance was looking at her now? The next day, she walked into the beauty parlor of her longtime friend, Rachel Whitmore. The small room smelled of hairspray and expensive shampoos. Soft jazz music blared from the speakers. "Is something wrong?" Rachel looked at her friend carefully, brushing her damp hair. "Your eyes glistened like they had when she was young." Marilyn hesitated. She'd known Rachel for over 20 years. They'd been through many ups and downs together. "Do you remember our new neighbor?" she asked quietly. Rachel froze with the hairbrush in her hand. "Marilyn." There was a warning in her voice. "Nothing happened," Marilyn added hastily. "We're just talking." "That's all?" Rachel raised an eyebrow skeptically. "He understands me. He sees the real me." Marilyn closed her eyes. It's been a long time since I felt so alive. Rachel put down her hairbrush and sat down next to her. Honey, I know things aren't going well with you and Garrett, but it's a dangerous game. Secrets don't last long in a small town. But it was too late. Casual meetings in cafes turned into secret dates in the park. Short conversations turned into long walks through deserted streets. One night, when Garrett left for an auto mechanics conference in Baton Rouge, Lance invited her to his house for dinner. His home was furnished simply but tastefully. There were black and white photographs of various cities on the walls and tattered volumes of Hemingway and Fitzgerald on the bookshelves. He cooked pasta with seafood, opened a bottle of white wine. I learned to cook in New Orleans, he explained, stirring the sauce. I worked in a restaurant there, and the chef was a real tyrant, but he taught me a lot. Marilyn sat on a high stool at the kitchen counter, watching his confident movements. At that moment, he seemed so at home, so right. Their first kiss happened that same night. They stood on the porch of her house saying goodbye. Drops of the beginning rain fell on their shoulders, but they didn't notice it. His lips were soft, with a slight tang of wine. Marilyn felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. I'm sorry, he whispered, pulling away. I shouldn't have. Don't apologize. She pulled him back, burying her fingers in his hair. At home, lying in the darkness of her bedroom, it was the first time she truly realized what she was doing. The wedding ring on her finger felt unbearably heavy. The photograph from their wedding, sitting on the dresser, seemed to reproach her. It showed her and Garrett so young, so happy. But she couldn't stop. Every meeting with Lance was like a breath of fresh air. He listened to her stories, laughed at her jokes, looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. After 15 years of a marriage that had become routine, it was more intoxicating than any wine. Rachel continued to caution her. You're playing with fire, dear. What happens when Garrett finds out? He won't find out, Marilyn answered stubbornly, though deep down she knew it was a lie. Every night as she cooked dinner for her husband, she thought about the time she had cooked with Lance. Every morning, waking up next to Garrett, she remembered kissing her lover. Guilt mixed with the excitement of secret meetings, creating an explosive cocktail of emotions. And Lake Charles lived its ordinary life. Neighbors exchanged the latest gossip over the fence. Elderly Mr. Johnson walked his lame pool. Mrs. Baker baked her famous pies for the Blue Oyster. No one noticed the middle-aged woman slowly but surely losing herself in the maelstrom of forbidden passion. October painted the streets of Lake Charles in gold and scarlet colors. Garrett Hayworth stood at the window of his machine shop, absent-mindedly wiping his hands with rags. Something had subtly changed in his life in recent weeks, and he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Marilyn. It was like she was different. New hair, new perfume, a special sparkle in her eyes. That evening, returning home earlier than usual, he found his wife trying on a new dress, a dark blue one with open shoulders. She shuddered when she saw his reflection in the mirror. I didn't hear you come in. Her voice sounded unusually high. Nice dress, he remarked, trying to sound casual. For a special occasion? Just for fun. She hastily removed the dress, putting it away in her closet. I wanted something new. He watched her bustle around the bedroom and remembered the last time they'd had a real conversation. Not about paying bills or grocery shopping, but about their feelings, their dreams, their fears. A month ago? A year? 5 years? Saturday morning, going through the mail, Garrett found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter typed on a computer and several photographs. The first picture showed Marilyn and Lance sitting at a table at the Blue Clam, their hands touching. In the second, they were kissing at the entrance to a city park. In the third, Garrett squeezed the photos with force, crumpling the glossy paper. Your wife and a neighbor have been dating for several weeks. I think you should know the truth. A well-wisher. He sat in the garage until evening, methodically disassembling and reassembling the old carburetor, trying to organize his thoughts. Pictures stood before his eyes, and scraps of memories swirled in his head. Her new perfume, late-night walks, to get groceries, odd pauses in conversations. Marilyn came home at 7, smelling fresh and wearing someone else's cologne. Where have you been? His voice sounded hoarse. At Rachel's salon. She hung her purse on a hook in the hallway. "Are you all right? You look tired." Instead of answering, he silently placed the pictures on the kitchen table. Marilyn froze, her face pale. "Garrett, How much?" His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "How long have you been deceiving me?" "It's not what you think." She took a step toward him, but he backed away. "Don't you dare!" His fist came down on the table with a clatter. "Don't you dare lie to me! I can see the pictures, I'm not blind!" Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to hurt you. It's so complicated." "Complicated?" He laughed bitterly. "What's complicated? You're sleeping with a boy who could be your little brother. Stop it." She wrapped her arms around herself. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Garrett walked to the bar and poured himself a whiskey. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of working my ass off to give you a decent life. And you... He took a swig of whiskey and turned to her. "Do you realize what I can do? The house is in my name. The workshop is mine too. You have nothing but your rags and jewelry. Are you threatening me?" Her voice trembled. "I'm stating the facts." He poured more whiskey. "If I file for divorce and prove you cheated on me, and I have proof," he nodded at the photographs, "you'll be left with nothing. No money, no house, no reputation." Marilyn slumped in her chair. Her shoulders slumped. "What do you want from me?" "Stop it." He set the glass on the table. "Now, no more meetings, no more talking. You won't see him again. And if I refuse, then get ready for a divorce. And believe me, I will do everything I can to make you regret your decision." Marilyn didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room, staring into the darkness outside the window. Lance's bedroom window was burning in the neighboring house. Her phone vibrated with his messages, but she didn't answer. At dawn, she threw on a light coat and left the house. The streets were deserted, with only a newspaperman delivering the morning mail. She walked, not taking the road until she was at the Blue Oyster. The cafe hadn't opened yet, but she knew Lance was coming in early to help set up for the workday. He showed up 10 minutes later, and her heart squeezed painfully at the sight of his familiar figure. "Marilyn, what's wrong?" He rushed over to her. "Why haven't you been answering your cell phone?" "Garrett knows," she said quietly. "Someone sent him the pictures." Lance turned pale. "What pictures?" "Of us, in the park, at the cafe." She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to keep from shaking. "He's threatening divorce. He says he's going to leave me with nothing. We'll figure something out." Lance tried to hug her, but she pulled away. "No, you don't understand. He can do this. I have nothing. No job, no savings. It's all in his name. Let's go away," he suggested suddenly. "I'll sell the house. I have some savings. We'll start over in another town." Marilyn grinned bitterly. "And then what? We'll live on your waiter's salary? Rent a room in a cheap motel? I'll find another job. We'll manage." "No," she shook her head. "This was a mistake. This whole thing is a mistake." "Don't say that." His voice trembled. "What's between us is real." "Real?" She looked him in the eye. "We live in a fantasy world, Lance. A world of secret meetings and stolen kisses. But reality is different. And I can't give up everything for an illusion. So it's over?" He looked lost, so young and vulnerable. "Yes." She took a step back. "Goodbye, Lance." She walked home, tears covering her eyes. The morning fog shrouded the streets, hiding the outlines of the houses. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded, as lonely and longing as the pain in her heart. Garrett was waiting for her in the kitchen. An untouched cup of coffee stood before him. "Have you made your decision?" he asked without looking at her. "Yes." Her voice sounded lifeless. "It's over." The sound of police sirens broke the morning silence of Lake Charles. Mrs. Baker, rushing to open the Blue Oyster, was the first to discover Lance Caulfield's body. He was lying in his garage, among scattered tools, his blonde hair stained with blood. A heavy, adjustable wrench lay nearby. Detective Eunice Sloan arrived on the scene 20 minutes after the call. Her shabby Chevy was parked behind the police cars, their flashers painting the walls of the houses in ominous red and blue. A light rain drizzled down, and she slipped a tattered raincoat over her shoulders. "What have we got?" she asked a young officer on duty at the yellow tape of the cordon. "Victim is Lance Caulfield, 33 years old. Hit on the head with a heavy object, presumably this adjustable wrench. The officer nodded toward the plastic evidence bag. Time of death was between 11 p.m. and 2 in the morning. Marcus Devereaux, her assistant, was already surveying the crime scene, making notes in a small notebook. His dark skin contrasted with his white shirt, which showed traces of morning coffee. "No sign of forced entry," he reported. "Looks like the victim knew his killer." Sloan took a good look around the garage. It was too neat. Except for the immediate murder scene, where the tools were lying around, the rest of the space looked untouched. It was as if someone had deliberately made it look like a struggle. "Interview the neighbors," she ordered. "I want to know everything about the victim, his habits, his daily routine, who he socialized with." By noon, the picture began to emerge. Mrs. Parker, who lived across the street, reported strange visits from a woman. Mr. Johnson recalled hearing a loud conversation coming from the Caulfield house the night before, and the owner of the Blue Oyster reluctantly confirmed that her former waiter had been spending a suspicious amount of time with a married customer. "Detective," Devereaux showed up with an update. "Neighbors claim the victim was having an affair with a woman from across the street, Marilyn Hayworth, married to the owner of an auto repair shop." Sloan tapped a pencil on her lips thoughtfully. "Bring Mrs. Hayworth in for questioning." Marilyn showed up at the station an hour later. She looked flawless, a strict black dress, pearl earrings, light makeup. Only her trembling hands betrayed her excitement. "Mrs. Hayworth," Sloan pointed to the chair across from her desk. "Tell me, where were you last night between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m.? At home?" Marilyn straightened a non-existent crease in her dress. "Watched TV, then went to bed." "Can anyone confirm that?" "My husband was at the workshop late. He came back around midnight." Sloan opened the case file. "According to our records, you had a intimate relationship with Mr. Caulfield." Marilyn turned pale but kept her composure. "It's in the past. It ended a few days ago." "Why?" "My husband found out, threatened a divorce." "And you just, ended the relationship?" Sloan scrutinized her reaction. "Yes, I couldn't lose everything." At that moment, Devereaux entered the office. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have new information. Bloody gloves were found in the dumpster behind the Hayworth house." Marilyn took a sharp breath. Sloan noticed her fingers gripping the armrests of her chair. "Are these your gloves, Mrs. Hayworth?" "Yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of gloves. We'll run a DNA test." Sloan leaned back in her chair. "If the blood is Mr. Caulfield's—" "I want a lawyer," Marilyn interrupted her. Her voice sounded unexpectedly firm. The next hours became a whirlwind of events. Forensics searched the Hayworth house, photographing every detail. In the bedroom, they found a wrinkled, dark blouse with traces of blood. In the bathroom, a recently laundered towel with barely visible brown stains. Garrett Hayworth arrived at the station right after his wife called. His work overalls were stained with machine oil, a look of disbelief on his face. "There must be some mistake," he repeated. Marilyn couldn't have. But the evidence said otherwise. The blood on the gloves matched the victim's. Marilyn's fingerprints were found on the crescent wrench, and her alibi for the night of the murder was only corroborated by her husband. "We have enough to make an arrest." Devereaux looked over the evidence. Sloan frowned, looking at the board of photos and notes. "Something's not right here, Marcus. It's all too obvious." "Sometimes the obvious solution is the right one," the young detective shrugged. "And sometimes it's what someone wants to show us." That evening, Sloan checked out the crime scene again. The rain had intensified, blurring the tracks on the ground near the garage. In the flashlight's light, she spotted something shiny under the workbench. Bending over, she pulled out a small keychain with the initials GH on it. "Interesting," she muttered, tucking the find into an evidence bag. At this time, tension reigned in the Hayworth home. Marilyn sat in the kitchen, mechanically stirring the cooled tea. Garrett paced the room, occasionally glancing at his wife. "They think it's me," she said quietly. "They think I killed him. It'll work out." Garrett put his hand on her shoulder. "You have a good lawyer." She looked at her husband with a long look. "Do you believe in my innocence?" He hesitated. "Of course. You're not capable of murder. There was certainty in his voice, but his eyes avoided her gaze. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, the police sirens howled again. The rainy weather in Lake Charles dragged on for days. Detective Sloan stood at the window of her office, watching the drops drumming on the glass. Her third cup of coffee was steaming on her desk, and her Caulfield case folder was swollen with new paperwork. A morning call from CSU had turned the whole investigation upside down. In a dumpster behind Garrett Hayworth's auto repair shop, they found a heavy wrench with traces of blood and the shop owner's distinct fingerprints. The murder weapon was a perfect match to the victim's head wound. It all fits. Marcus Devereaux arranged the evidence photos on the board. Garrett finds out about his wife's affair, tracks down the lover and kills him, then tries to frame Marilyn by planting bloody gloves. Sloan tapped her pencil thoughtfully on the table. And the keychain? The one we found in Caulfield's garage? Probably dropped it during the murder, Devereaux shrugged. That only confirms his presence at the crime scene. Garrett Hayworth was arrested early in the morning. He was just opening the shop when the police cars pulled up. Neighbors looked out their windows as the respected auto mechanic was led out in handcuffs. Mrs. Parker crossed herself as she stood on her front porch, and Mr. Johnson shook his head, saying, "Who would have thought?" Marilyn learned of her husband's arrest from Rachel. Her friend rushed to her house as soon as she heard the news. "Oh my God." Rachel hugged a trembling Marilyn. "What's going on? First you're a suspect, now Garrett." All they talked about at the Blue Clam was the Hayworth family. Mrs. Baker, pouring coffee for her regulars, sighed. "Poor Marilyn." First that handsome Lance turned her head. Now her husband turned out to be a murderer. "I always said there's trouble in a quiet place," Mrs. Wilson said, adding a third lump of sugar to her cappuccino. Garrett seemed so calm, so positive. At the police station, Garrett Hayworth sat across from Detective Sloan. His work clothes had been replaced by an orange prisoner's jumpsuit, but he was surprisingly calm. "Tell me again where you were the night of the murder." Sloan opened her notebook. "I already told you. I worked late at the shop, then came home around midnight." "And you didn't go out?" Garrett paused. "No." "Interesting." Sloan pulled out an evidence bag. "Then how did your wrench end up in the dumpster? With the victim's blood and your fingerprints?" He turned pale, but his voice remained firm. "I don't know. I have a lot of tools. Some go missing." "Let me get this straight, Mr. Hayworth." Sloan stepped forward. "Did you know about your wife's relationship with Lance Caulfield?" There was a long pause, then a quiet answer. "Yes, someone sent me pictures." "And you didn't do anything about it?" "I did." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I talked to Marilyn, threatened divorce. She promised to end the relationship." "But you didn't believe her?" "I did." He rubbed his face tiredly. "Marilyn, she wouldn't risk the life she was accustomed to." That's when Devereaux came into the interview room. "Excuse me, detective, there's a phone call for you. It's forensics." Sloan went out into the hallway, leaving Garrett alone with his thoughts. She returned a few minutes later and something in her gaze had changed. "Mr. Hayworth, the blood test on the wrench turned up something interesting. It's not just Mr. Caulfield's blood. There are traces of someone else's blood there." Garrett looked up at her with tired eyes. "And what does that mean?" "It means that either you have a very detailed explanation for what happened, or..." She paused. "Or someone has gone to great lengths to make sure that all the evidence points to you." That evening, Sloan sat in her office, going over her notes. Something was bugging her. She spread the crime scene photos, expert reports, witness statements on the table. "Marcus," she called out to her assistant, "remember the gloves they found in the Hayworth's trash?" "Of course," Devereaux nodded. "They were covered in the victim's blood. Don't you find it odd that a man smart enough to plan a murder and frame his wife would leave such obvious evidence?" Devereaux wondered. Maybe he was acting out of passion. Then why are all the other clues so neat? Sloan tapped her finger on the picture of the wrench. Perfect prints, as if someone had left them there on purpose. The keychain at the crime scene, like it was dropped on purpose. "You think this is a setup?" "I think we're missing something." She reached for another cup of coffee. "Who sent Garrett the pictures? Why didn't Lance leave town after the relationship broke up? And most importantly, Whose other blood is on the murder weapon? At this time, Marilyn sat home alone, leafing through an old photo album. Snapshots from their wedding, a vacation in Florida, the day Garrett opened his workshop, 15 years of life captured on glossy paper. The phone rang. The number was unrecognizable. Mrs. Hayworth. Sloane's voice sounded formal. I have a few additional questions. Could you come down to the station tomorrow? Sure, Marilyn answered, feeling a chill run down her spine. What time? 10 o'clock in the morning. And Mrs. Hayworth. The detective hesitated. Perhaps you should bring a lawyer. After hanging up the phone, Marilyn went to the window. The lights were on in the house across the street from where Lance had lived a short time ago. The police were still working there. On the windowsill was a forgotten pot of geraniums, a flower slowly wilting without watering. Somewhere in the city, a clock struck midnight. In the holding cell, Garrett Hayworth lay on a narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling. In Detective Sloane's office, the lights were on. She was rereading witness statements, trying to find a missing detail. And in her home, Marilyn pulled a box of old clothes out of the closet and stared at its contents for a long time before resolutely slamming the lid shut. It had been a week since Garrett Hayworth's arrest. Marcus Devereaux sat at his desk, littered with files and coffee cups, rereading the forensics report for the third time. There was something about those perfectly clean fingerprints on the wrench that made him uneasy. Detective Sloane, he called out as his boss entered the office, shaking raindrops off her raincoat. Have you ever seen such clear prints on a metal tool? Eunice walked over to his desk, peering into the photographs. What's the matter, Marcus? Look, he pointed to the pictures. These prints, they're too perfect. It's like someone put Hayworth's fingers on the key on purpose. Work tools usually leave smudges, partial prints. But here? Sloane frowned. Go on. I checked the security footage near the workshop. Garrett was indeed there until midnight the night of the murder, and his car never left the parking lot. But the murder happened between 11 and 2. Sloane tapped her fingers on the table thoughtfully. He could have walked. He could have, Devereaux agreed. But then why go back to the workshop to dump the murder weapon? Why not dispose of it on the way? At that moment, a young officer entered the office with a new report. Detectives, we have the results of the analysis of the second blood sample from the wrench. Sloane quickly reviewed the document. The blood belongs to Garrett Hayworth himself. What? Devereaux jumped up from his seat. But he doesn't have any wounds. Exactly. Sloane put the report on the table. No wounds that would explain his blood on the murder weapon. Unless someone kept a sample of his blood, Devereaux finished. They looked at each other. There was a heavy silence in the office, broken only by the sound of rain outside the window. At the same time, in the beauty parlor, Rachel Whitmore was watching her friend. Marilyn had come in for a routine manicure, but something about her behavior seemed odd. She was distracted, flinching several times at the sound of the front door. How are you holding up? Rachel asked cautiously, working on her nails. Fine. Marilyn shrugged her shoulders. Garrett's lawyer says there's not enough evidence to convict. What do you think? Rachel looked at her friend carefully. Could he have done it? Marilyn looked away. I don't know. I'm not sure of anything anymore. Rachel remembered the day Marilyn had first told her about her affair with Lance. She'd been so alive, so excited, as if she'd been 10 years younger. And then the sudden breakup, Garrett's threats, the murder. Were you home that night? Rachel suddenly asked. Marilyn froze. What? The night of the murder? You told the police you were home? Yes, of course. Marilyn tried to smile. Why do you ask? It's just... Rachel hesitated. I called you that night, several times. I wanted to make sure you were okay after everything that happened, but you didn't answer. Something akin to fear flashed across Marilyn's face, but she pulled herself together quickly. I was taking sleeping pills. I must have been a heavy sleeper. Rachel nodded, but doubt had already settled in her soul. At the police station, the detectives continued their work. Devereaux was interviewing neighbors, trying to reconstruct the chronology of the events of that night. Strange, he said, returning from another interview. Mrs. Parker claims she saw Marilyn leave the house about 11 o'clock at night, but she said she was home all night. Sloane raised an eyebrow. Exactly. And there's something else. They found a receipt from a convenience store pharmacy in the dumpster behind the Hayworth's house. The time of purchase was 11:30. Sloane picked up the receipt. What was purchased? Bandages and antiseptic. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. A flustered Rachel Whitmore stood on the doorstep. "Detective Sloane?" She fidgeted nervously with the strap of her purse. "There's something I need to tell you. About Marilyn." Rachel spent the next hour talking about her friend's strange behavior. About how Marilyn said Lance wouldn't let her go. About how she'd once caught her crying in the parlor, but Marilyn refused to explain why. And the phone calls the night of the murder that went unanswered. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sloane asked. "Because..." Rachel took a deep breath. "I saw something at the salon this morning. Marilyn had forgotten her makeup bag. I wanted it back, opened it to see if it was definitely Marilyn's, and found this." She pulled a small key out of her bag. "It's the key to Lance's garage," Rachel explained. "I know for sure because I saw one just like it on him once. He said it was the only duplicate." Sloane gingerly picked up the key in her rubber gloves. "Why are you sure Marilyn shouldn't have it?" "Because after they broke up, Lance told me he took the key back. He didn't want her to be able to come to him at any time." Devereaux and Sloane looked at each other. A picture was beginning to emerge, but in a new way. "Check every drugstore within a 5-mile radius of the Hayworth house," Sloane ordered. "I want surveillance tapes from that night. And find me who sent Garrett the photos. This could be our clue." That evening, detectives revisited the crime scene. The garage looked ominous in the light of the flashlights. Sloane walked slowly through the room, noting every detail. "Look!" Devereaux suddenly exclaimed, sitting down at the workbench. "There's something here." He carefully pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of the gap between the floorboards. It was a handwritten note. "It's over. I can't go on like this. I'm sorry." "Marilyn's handwriting," Sloane said quietly, comparing the note to the sample from the case file. "But we don't know when it was written," Devereaux objected. "Now we know for sure it was here." Sloane put the note away in the evidence bag. "And it looks like it wasn't just a friendly encounter." The Lake Charles police station was unusually quiet for the morning. Rachel Whitmore sat in Detective Sloane's office, her usually immaculate hair disheveled and her eyes red from sleep. "I should have noticed sooner." Her voice trembled. "There were signs. So many signs." Sloane waited patiently for the woman to gather her thoughts. The day Garrett found out about their relationship, Marilyn came to the salon. She wasn't herself. Rachel fidgeted with her handkerchief, saying strange things. About how Lance didn't understand the word no, that he threatened to tell her himself if she didn't leave her husband. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Devereaux asked, making notes in his notebook. "I didn't want to believe." Rachel shook her head. "We've been friends for 20 years. I was at her wedding, held her hand when her mother died. How could I have thought she was capable of..." At that moment, an agitated officer entered the office. "Detective, they found a bag in the lake. There are tools and clothes with traces of blood in them." Sloane got up quickly. "Where exactly?" "In a part of the lake where no one usually walks." A fisherman hooked the bag with a fishing pole. Half an hour later, the detectives were there. Inside the gym bag were bloody clothes, rubber gloves, and a heavy metal rod, the kind usually used for changing tires. "That's the real murder weapon," Sloane examined the find. "And the wrench was planted later to throw suspicion on Garrett." "But how did she get his blood?" Devereaux asked. "Remember the receipt from the drugstore? Bandages and antiseptic?" Sloane thought for a moment. "Check the records in Garrett's shop. I bet he cut himself while working the day before he was killed." By late afternoon, the picture was complete. Surveillance cameras at the drugstore caught Marilyn buying medicine. The next day, she brought her husband's lunch to the shop for the first time in months, and the used bandages with his blood on them disappeared from the trash can. Marilyn was called in for questioning one last time. She entered the room with the same impeccable posture, but something in her eyes had changed. Sloane spread the photos on the table. The bag from the lake, the bloody clothes, the note from the garage. "You know what's interesting about this case, Mrs. Hayworth?" The detective started it. "It's how meticulously you planned this whole thing. Planted evidence against yourself, knowing it was too obvious. Then you created the perfect proof of your husband's guilt. You used his blood, his tools. Marilyn was silent, staring at the photographs. But you made a mistake, Sloane continued. You didn't realize that true love doesn't die so easily. Garrett, despite your betrayal, didn't believe you were guilty. He defended you to the last. A tear rolled down Marilyn's cheek. He was possessed. Her voice was muffled. Lance, he wouldn't let me go. Threatened to tell Garrett everything, to ruin my life. Said if he couldn't have me, no one would. So you decided to kill him? I just wanted to talk. She clutched her hands to the table. To explain that it was over, but he laughed, saying I'd come back, that I wasn't going anywhere. He grabbed my hand. Her voice broke. I saw the crowbar on the workbench. It all happened so fast. And then you decided to frame your husband? Marilyn covered her face with her hands. I panicked. I knew everyone would think it was me. Or Garrett. I figured he'd have a better chance of vindicating himself. He's got a workshop, respect in town. What do I have? A reputation as the unfaithful wife? An hour later, Marilyn's lawyer showed up at the station. 2 hours later, Garrett Hayworth was released from his cell. He walked outside, squinting against the bright sun. Sloane was waiting for him at the entrance. I'm sorry, she said. We should have checked the evidence better. Garrett shook his head. You were doing your job, and I just didn't want to believe that the woman I'd loved for 15 years would do something like that. The news of Marilyn Hayworth's arrest spread through Lake Charles with the speed of wildfire. At the Blue Oyster, Mrs. Baker served free coffee to anyone who wanted to discuss recent events. Mr. Johnson missed his evening walk with his dog for the first time in years, clinging to the television set where news of the case was spinning. And at the police station, Marilyn was writing a confession. Her neat handwriting grew more uneven with each page. I didn't mean to kill him, but when he grabbed me, something inside broke. All the humiliation, the threats, the manipulation of the last few weeks. I saw the tire iron and I just wanted him to shut up. One blow was all it took. I don't remember how I came up with the plan to frame Garrett. I must have watched too many crime shows, collected his blood from his bandages, planted evidence. I knew the police would suspect me first, so I made it too obvious. And then I sent them to Garrett, knowing he had an alibi, that he could justify himself. I don't deserve to be forgiven, but Garrett, he didn't deserve what I put him through.